You're too old to understand modern dining concepts, Dorothy. This isn't your little diner from the 1980s. Amber's words still burned in my ears 3 weeks later as I sat in my car outside Lumiere, the upscale restaurant she'd opened without so much as mentioning it during our family dinners. For 40 years, I had run Morrison's family restaurant with my late husband, Robert. We'd built it from a single modest location into a respected chain of 5 before selling it after his death 2 years ago. Apparently, those decades of experience meant nothing to a 38-year-old woman who had never worked a single day in hospitality before marrying my son. The glass facade of Lumiere gleamed beneath the early evening lights. Clean lines, minimalist decor, and pretentious typography that screamed expensive mediocrity. Valets in crisp uniforms guided luxury cars into neat rows while elegantly dressed couples drifted toward the entrance, laughing softly under lighting fixtures that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Modern dining concepts, I muttered. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I spotted Amber gliding between tables in a designer dress that cost far more than she should have been able to afford on Bradley's insurance adjuster salary. That too had been gnawing at me. The sudden influx of expensive clothes, jewelry, and now this restaurant didn't align with my son's modest income, especially when they'd asked me for small loans just 6 months earlier to cover mortgage payments. My phone buzzed. "Bradley, Mom, can we talk tomorrow? I need some advice about some papers Amber wants me to sign." Papers. This was the 3rd time in 2 months Bradley had mentioned documents he didn't fully understand. Whenever I asked questions, he grew vague, insisting Amber handled their finances because she was better with numbers. The same woman who told me I was too old to understand her restaurant business was apparently managing complex financial instruments that required my son's signature, but not his comprehension. I stayed in my car for another hour, watching the dinner rush unfold. Amber moved with practiced confidence, but something about her demeanor felt rehearsed rather than authentic. Her smiles were precise, her laughter carefully timed. Conversations with staff appeared tense beneath their polite veneers, and she spent an unusual amount of time in intense discussion with a man who was clearly not a customer, and certainly not dressed like one. By the time I drove home to my empty house in Riverside Hills, I'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible that morning. I was going to find out exactly what Amber was hiding, and I was going to do it using skills she'd apparently forgotten I possessed. The next morning I called my attorney. "Dorothy," Margaret Henley said calmly, "what kind of concerns are you having?" "I'm worried Amber may be manipulating Bradley into signing documents that could affect our family's financial security. She's opened an extremely expensive restaurant on income that shouldn't support that level of investment, and Bradley doesn't understand what he's being asked to sign. Do you have any evidence of financial manipulation or fraud?" "Not yet," I admitted, "but I want to protect my assets while I investigate what's really going on." We spent over an hour reviewing my estate planning and reinforcing safeguards on my investment accounts and property holdings. Margaret implemented password protections, identity verification protocols, and multi-step authorization requirements that would prevent anyone from accessing my assets without my explicit consent. "These measures will protect you," she said carefully, "but if you suspect criminal activity, you may need to involve law enforcement." "I need evidence before I make accusations that could destroy my family," I replied. "But I intend to be prepared." That afternoon I drove to a beauty supply store across town, far from anyone who might recognize me, and purchased items I hadn't used since my theater days in college. A blonde wig, oversized glasses, and makeup designed to soften age lines, alter skin tone, and subtly reshape facial features. At home, I practiced until the woman in my mirror bore no resemblance to Dorothy Morrison, the 72-year-old widow Amber had dismissed as obsolete. With strategic contouring and posture, I looked early 60s at most, someone who could blend seamlessly into a restaurant staff without a second glance. That evening, I researched Lumiere's employment history. Online job boards and social media revealed a pattern of frequent hiring. Former employees cited high turnover, unrealistic expectations, and demanding management. Perfect. The next morning, Luna Stevens, my carefully constructed alter ego, applied for a server position at Lumiere. Her resume listed 40 years of restaurant experience, but made no mention of Morrison's family restaurant or any connection to the Morrison name. "Your experience is impressive," said Jake Martinez, the assistant manager, scanning my resume. Most applicants don't have this level of industry knowledge. When could you start? Immediately, I replied. I thrive in high-standard environments. Within the hour, I was scheduled for a trial shift that weekend. Uniform requirements, training materials, dining protocols. As Luna Stevens walked out of the restaurant where Dorothy Morrison had been deemed irrelevant, I felt a satisfaction I hadn't experienced since Robert's death. Amber wanted to exclude me from understanding her business. Fine. I would understand it from the inside, where she couldn't control the narrative. My first shift began at 5 o'clock on a busy Friday evening, and within minutes I understood why staff turnover was so high. Amber ran Lumiere like a military operation crossed with a reality television show, demanding perfection while cultivating constant anxiety. Table assignments are everything here, whispered Jessica, a server in her 20s who'd been working there 3 months, apparently long enough to be considered senior staff. Mrs. Morrison has very specific requirements. She changes assignments without warning, based on factors we don't always understand. It was surreal hearing my own name spoken by someone who had no idea who I really was. Some grandmothers knit scarves and bake cookies when they feel underestimated. This grandmother became the most observant waitress in the most elegant restaurant her daughter-in-law had ever opened. And unlike Amber, I actually knew how to run a successful restaurant. She just didn't know it yet. I maintained Luna's cheerful demeanor while quietly absorbing Lumiere's complex hierarchy and unspoken rules. What kind of factors? I asked, genuinely curious about how Amber made her operational decisions. Well, certain tables are always reserved for Mrs. Morrison to serve personally, Jessica explained. Tables 7 and 14 and 22 are completely off-limits to regular staff. She handles those customers exclusively and doesn't want anyone else approaching those areas. Interesting. In 40 years of restaurant management, I had never encountered an owner who personally served specific tables while delegating everything else to staff. That level of hands-on involvement suggested either extraordinary service standards or something far more secretive than hospitality excellence. And what happens if customers request different seating arrangements? I asked. Mrs. Morrison controls the reservation system herself, Jessica said. Guests can request specific tables, but she decides final placement. The hostess just follows her seating charts without question. I spent my first evening learning Lumiere's service protocols while observing Amber from my new position as invisible staff. What I discovered was fascinating and concerning in equal measure. Amber's demeanor with employees was professional but cold, markedly different from her warm public persona. She micromanaged every detail of service while maintaining constant surveillance of the dining room, paying particular attention to tables 7 and 14 and 22. Despite the restaurant being fully booked during the dinner rush, those tables remained conspicuously empty. Luna, excellent work tonight, Jake told me as we cleaned up after service. You handled that difficult table better than servers with years of fine dining experience. Thank you, Jake. I paused. I noticed some tables stayed empty all evening. Is that normal for weekend service? Those are Mrs. Morrison's private tables, he said. She uses them for special meetings and important customers. We're instructed to keep them available regardless of demand. Private meetings. In a restaurant where every table represented significant revenue, keeping prime seating empty during peak hours meant those meetings generated more value than standard customer service ever could. Over the following week, I established myself as a reliable, experienced server who understood both the technical demands of fine dining and the social dynamics of upscale restaurant culture. My 40 years in the industry allowed Luna Stevens to impress management, while giving Dorothy Morrison the freedom to observe her family from complete invisibility. The breakthrough came during my second week. Amber finally used Table 7 for what she described to staff as a private business dinner. I was assigned to nearby tables, positioning me perfectly to observe her interaction with a guest who was clearly not a typical Lumiere customer. The man was in his 50s, wearing an expensive suit that couldn't disguise his discomfort in refined social settings. His jewelry was flashy rather than elegant, and his aggressively direct conversation style caused nearby diners to glance over with visible disapproval. What caught my attention most, however, was Amber herself. She was nervous, deferential in a way that contradicted her usual commanding presence. She kept checking her phone, scanning the dining room, and speaking in lowered tones that suggested anxiety rather than casual business discussion. Their body language told a story of financial pressure, not friendly negotiation. Documents were spread across the table. The man gestured sharply at them while Amber nodded with obvious reluctance. When I approached to refresh their water glasses, a service protocol that allowed brief proximity, I caught fragments of conversation that made my blood run cold. Your husband's signature on these deeds. The old lady doesn't know about the second mortgage. Bradley won't ask questions if you handle it right. I maintained Luna's professional composure while my mind raced. Second mortgage deeds. Bradley's signature. And the chilling reference to the old lady, spoken with casual contempt. The meeting lasted 2 hours. It ended with Amber promising to have everything ready by the following week. The man reminded her pointedly about interest rates and consequences for delays. As he stood to leave, he handed her an envelope, which she slipped into her purse without opening. That night I sat alone in my kitchen, still wearing Luna's blonde wig, trying to process what I had witnessed. Amber was involved in something deeply troubling. Financial arrangements requiring forged signatures, concealed mortgages, and meetings with men who resembled loan sharks more than legitimate business partners. The old lady who didn't know about the second mortgage could only be me. I was the only elderly woman in the family with substantial property holdings that could be used as collateral. But what kind of loans required clandestine meetings in restaurant back corners? And why was Amber so nervous if everything was legal? Before going to bed, I made 2 phone calls. First, to Margaret, my attorney, asking her to investigate any recent mortgage activity or property liens involving my family. Second, to Tom Reeves, a private investigator I'd used years ago for discreet employee background checks. Dorothy, Tom said carefully, you want surveillance on your own daughter-in-law? Tom, I believe my daughter-in-law may be involved in financial fraud that could endanger my family's security. I need to know who she's meeting with and what kind of arrangements she's making. And you're working at her restaurant undercover? I'm gathering information from a position where she doesn't know she's being observed. Some mothers-in-law worried about infidelity. I was beginning to suspect something far worse, criminal activity, designed to steal my family's assets while turning my son into an unwitting accomplice. The next evening, I paid close attention to tables 14 and 22. Luna Stevens was becoming the most observant waitress in the history of upscale dining surveillance. By my 3rd week at Lumiere, I discovered something that changed everything I thought I knew about Amber's character. Tuesday evenings were quieter, giving me better opportunities to observe her private meetings without the distraction of a packed dining room. Table 14 had been reserved for what the hostess described as Mrs. Morrison's weekly business consultation, an odd phrase. In my experience, successful restaurants didn't require weekly consultations unless something was seriously wrong. The man who joined Amber that night was nothing like the loan shark type from table 7. He was younger, early 40s, impeccably dressed, radiating wealth and ease in upscale environments. His interaction with Amber was intimate. Subtle touches, prolonged eye contact, conversations that suggested romance rather than business. I positioned myself nearby, delivering flawless service while maintaining perfect surveillance. What I observed made me physically ill. Amber was having an affair, but this was more than infidelity. Their discussion revolved around my family's finances, my son's legal vulnerabilities, and strategies for accessing assets that belonged to me. Bradley signed the power of attorney documents yesterday, Amber said as I refilled a nearby bread basket. He thinks they're for refinancing, but they actually give me control over his financial decisions. And the signature practice? The man asked, his hand lingering possessively on hers. I've been copying Dorothy's handwriting for months, Amber replied calmly. Bradley brings documents home from family business meetings. I study her signature until I can replicate it perfectly. I nearly dropped the water pitcher. She had manipulated my son into surrender, control of his finances, and was preparing to forge my signature. The trust fund documents will be ready next week, the man continued. Once we transfer Dorothy's assets into accounts we control, we liquidate everything and disappear before anyone realizes. What about Bradley? Amber asked. There was concern in her voice, but not the kind a loving wife should have. He'll be legally responsible for any financial crimes committed under the power of attorney, the man said smoothly. If authorities investigate, he'll look like the primary perpetrator. You maintain plausible deniability. My son wasn't just being deceived. He was being set up as the fall guy for a crime that would destroy his life. How long before Dorothy gets suspicious? The man asked. She's 72 and completely trusting when it comes to family, Amber replied dismissively. As long as Bradley doesn't ask questions, she'll never suspect her own daughter-in-law. They spent the next hour discussing my accounts, timing asset transfers, and contingency plans if Bradley became suspicious. The most chilling moment came when they discussed what would happen if I discovered their scheme too soon. Dorothy's age and recent widowhood make accidents believable, Amber said casually. Medication interactions, falls, driving mishaps. I stood frozen, smiling politely at guests, as my daughter-in-law calmly discussed my possible death over dinner. There are numerous possibilities for elderly people who become inconvenient obstacles to family financial plans. I maintained Luna's professional demeanor while internally screaming at the realization that my daughter-in-law and her criminal partner were calmly discussing murdering me if I interfered with their elaborate theft scheme. When their meeting ended with passionate kissing that confirmed their romantic relationship, I excused myself to the staff bathroom and activated the voice recording app on my phone. Every conversation I'd overheard needed to be documented for legal purposes. I needed evidence. Evidence that would protect both Bradley and myself from Amber's criminal conspiracy. That night I called Tom Reeves with an urgent update. Dorothy, he said gravely, if what you overheard is accurate, your daughter-in-law is planning multiple felonies: fraud, forgery, theft, and potentially murder. This has moved far beyond family conflict into serious criminal territory. Tom, what should I do? I asked. I can't let Bradley sign any more documents, but I also can't reveal what I've learned without compromising my position at the restaurant. You need to maintain your cover long enough to gather solid evidence, he replied. But you also need immediate legal protection, for your assets and for your son. The next morning, I met with Margaret Henley to establish emergency safeguards for my estate and begin formally documenting Amber's criminal activities for law enforcement. Based on what you've told me, Margaret said, I'm implementing immediate freezes on all accounts. Any access will require in-person verification with multiple forms of identification. No forged signatures. No fraudulent power of attorney documents. And Bradley? I asked. If he's already signed papers giving Amber legal authority, how do we protect him from criminal liability? We'll need proof that he was deceived about what he signed, Margaret explained. Your undercover work may be the only way to establish that your son is a victim, not a co-conspirator. That evening, I returned to Lumiere for another shift, fully aware that Luna Stevens had become more than a disguised grandmother quietly observing family dynamics. I was now an undercover witness gathering evidence of a criminal conspiracy that threatened my family's safety and my life. Some mothers-in-law worry about infidelity or irresponsibility. I had discovered that my daughter-in-law was a criminal mastermind planning to steal my life savings, frame my son for financial fraud, and potentially murder me if I interfered. Tomorrow night, I would pay very close attention to Table 22. I suspected Amber's network extended far beyond one affair partner and one loan shark. And Luna Stevens was going to document every detail before they could destroy my family. Table 22 revealed the full scope of Amber's operation during my 4th week of undercover surveillance. That Tuesday evening, the meeting included 3 people I'd never seen before. A middle-aged woman in an expensive business suit, a younger man with the polished look of a financial professional, and someone who appeared to have stepped straight out of a legal drama, carrying a high-end briefcase. This wasn't adultery or theft. This was organized crime. Luna, refill the wine at table 22 and make sure their water glasses stay full, Jake instructed with unusual precision. Mrs. Morrison specifically requested that you handle their service tonight. A chill ran through me. Why would Amber request Luna Stevens specifically? Did she suspect something? Or did she simply want an experienced server who wouldn't interrupt? As I approached with the wine, I realized the truth. The conversation involved complex financial planning, and Luna's seamless service ensured no interruptions and no attention drawn to the criminal plotting happening in plain sight. The power of attorney documents are legally sound, the woman in the business suit explained. Bradley Morrison has unknowingly granted his wife authority over financial decisions, including access to trust accounts and property transfers. What about Dorothy Morrison's independent assets? Asked the man with the briefcase. Her investments in real estate aren't covered. That's where signature forgery becomes essential, Amber replied, glancing around the restaurant. I've been practicing Dorothy's handwriting for months using documents Bradley brings home. I poured wine with steady hands while listening to a detailed plan to steal my life savings and destroy my son. The timing must be perfect, the financial professional continued. We transfer Dorothy's assets into controlled accounts, liquidate within 72 hours, and disappear. And Bradley's liability? Amber asked, sounding almost concerned. He'll face criminal charges for fraud committed under his power of attorney. Law enforcement will see him as the primary perpetrator. What if Dorothy becomes suspicious? The woman asked. Amber shrugged casually. Dorothy Morrison is 72. Recently widowed, trusting, isolated. Vulnerable. Accidents happen to elderly people who become inconvenient. The man with the briefcase opened it. Inside were documents that froze my blood. Pre-signed death certificates bearing my name. Medication overdose. Accidental fall. Car accident. Heart failure. We have multiple options, he said flatly. If she interferes. And the timeline? Amber asked, studying them like menus. 2 weeks. Maximum. Transfers first. Eliminate witnesses before Bradley questions anything. I maintained Luna's professional composure while internally screaming. I had less than 2 weeks to gather evidence, protect my son, and stop my own murder. Assignments were distributed. The woman would handle banking. The financial professional would liquidate assets. The legal specialist would prepare backups. Amber would keep Bradley compliant and perfect my forged signature. After they left, Amber stayed at table 22, making phone calls that suggested even more conspirators. The network was larger than I'd feared. Luna, she said as I cleared the table, excellent service tonight. I appreciate your discretion. Of course, Mrs. Morrison, I replied evenly. Confidentiality is essential in fine dining. She smiled. Exactly. Some conversations require absolute privacy. Locking eyes with her while she praised my discretion, after discussing plans to steal my fortune and kill me, was surreal. That night, I called an emergency meeting with Tom Reeves and Margaret Henley. It was time to intervene, before Amber's criminal network put their plan into motion. Dorothy, Tom said grimly, based on what you've described, we're dealing with organized crime. Multiple conspirators. Planned fraud, theft, and murder. This requires immediate law enforcement involvement. I understand, I said, keeping my voice steady. But I need evidence that will protect Bradley from criminal liability, while exposing Amber's conspiracy. If we move too fast, Bradley could be arrested as a co-conspirator before we can prove he was manipulated. Margaret leaned forward. Dorothy, you're in extreme personal danger. These people discuss murdering you with a level of professional detachment that suggests prior experience with violence. That's exactly why I need 1 more week, I replied. 1 week to gather irrefutable evidence while implementing protection for Bradley and myself. We developed a plan that balanced my safety with the need for conclusive proof. Tom would arrange 24-hour surveillance to ensure my protection. Margaret would prepare legal documents to immediately freeze all family assets and revoke any power of attorney authorizations Bradley had unknowingly signed. We're also installing recording equipment, Tom added. It will capture everything said at tables 7, 14, and 22 during your remaining shifts. Your testimony alone won't be enough to convict organized criminals with expensive legal teams. And Bradley? I asked. How do we warn him without compromising the investigation? We'll create a situation where he discovers Amber's deception naturally, Margaret said, without revealing your undercover role until we have enough evidence to arrest everyone involved. The next morning, I called Bradley and arranged an urgent family meeting. I told him there were important financial documents I needed to discuss. Some grandmothers worried about their grandchildren's college funds and holiday gift planning. I was planning my daughter-in-law's arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. while protecting my son from criminal charges tied to fraud he'd unknowingly enabled. I had less than 2 weeks to save my family before Amber's criminal network executed their plan to steal everything I owned and eliminate any witnesses. Luna Stevens was about to become the most dangerous waitress in the history of organized crime surveillance. The emergency family meeting took place at my house on Sunday afternoon. I scheduled it strategically. During the time Amber claimed she'd be at the restaurant handling inventory and staff training. In reality, I knew from the Lumiere schedule that Amber wasn't working Sundays. That meant she was likely meeting with her conspirators to finalize plans for asset theft and my murder. "Mom, what's so urgent about these financial documents?" Bradley asked, settling into the living room armchair where his father used to read the evening paper. Amber smiled sweetly. "You've been asking strange questions about papers I've signed, and she's worried you might be getting confused about family business matters." The casual way Bradley echoed Amber's manipulation, framing my legitimate concerns as elderly confusion, revealed how thoroughly she'd conditioned him to dismiss anything that threatened her control. "Bradley," I said, "I need you to bring me every document you've signed for Amber in the past 6 months. I want to review them before we discuss anything else." "Mom, those are just routine papers," he replied. "Mortgage refinancing, investment account updates. Amber handles all our financial planning. She's better with numbers than I am." "Please humor your elderly, confused mother," I said quietly. "Bring me the papers. I promise I'll explain once I've seen what you actually signed." An hour later, Bradley returned with a manila folder that made my worst fears seem optimistic. Inside were documents granting Amber comprehensive power of attorney, complete authority over Bradley's finances, including access to any inheritance or family assets he might receive, a mortgage refinancing agreement that used my property as collateral without my knowledge or consent, investment account authorizations giving Amber control over Bradley's retirement funds, and any assets transferred from family accounts. Most disturbing was a revised will. It left everything to Amber in the event of Bradley's death, with provisions transferring any inherited family assets directly into her control. "Bradley," I asked carefully, "did you read these documents before signing them?" "Amber explained everything," he said. "The power of attorney protects our finances if I'm incapacitated. The refinancing lowers interest rates. The investments maximize returns. And the will ensures Amber's protected if something happens to me. This power of attorney gives Amber authority over my assets if they're ever transferred to you," I said. "Did she explain that clause?" "She said it was standard language for married couples," he replied. "Mom, why are you questioning Amber's financial management? She's doubled our savings in the past year." I realized then that Amber had been showing Bradley fabricated account summaries, convincing him her management was brilliant, while quietly using his authorizations to access credit and loans that would eventually destroy his financial security. "Bradley," I asked, "have you ever seen original bank statements for these investment accounts? Or tax documents?" "Amber handles all that," he said. "She gives me monthly reports showing our portfolio performance. And you've never asked to see the actual statements." "Mom, I trust my wife to manage our finances responsibly. She's better educated about investment strategies than I am." The depth of Bradley's manipulation was heartbreaking. Amber had convinced my son that questioning her financial activities represented a lack of trust in their marriage, while she systematically gained legal control over every asset he owned, or might one day inherit. "Bradley, I need to show you something," I said gently. "It may be difficult to accept about Amber's recent activities." I handed him printed copies of the photographs Tom Reeves had taken, images of Amber meeting with her conspirators, along with partial transcripts of conversations I'd overheard during my undercover work at Lumiere. "Mom," Bradley asked slowly, staring at the pages, "where did these photos come from? And why do you have transcripts of private conversations?" "Bradley, I've been investigating Amber's business activities," I said carefully, "because I was concerned about the financial documents you've been signing, and her sudden ability to afford an expensive restaurant on your salary." "You've been investigating my wife?" His voice hardened. "Mom, this sounds like you're developing paranoid thoughts, maybe related to grief or aging." I felt the familiar sting of dismissal. I realized then that any evidence I presented would be brushed aside as elderly paranoia unless Bradley witnessed Amber's criminal behavior with his own eyes. Amber had spent months conditioning him to interpret any criticism of her actions as proof of mental deterioration in his family. "Bradley," I said quietly, "will you agree to one test of Amber's honesty?" "What kind of test?" "Come with me to Lumiere tomorrow evening during her private business meeting. We'll observe her interactions with the people she's been meeting with. You can judge for yourself whether what she's doing looks like legitimate restaurant business." He recoiled. "Mom, spying on my wife during business meetings seems incredibly inappropriate." "If Amber's meetings are legitimate," I replied, "then observing them won't reveal anything that damages your marriage. But if her activities are deceptive or criminal, you need to know before you sign any additional documents." He hesitated. "And if I agree to this, will you promise to stop investigating Amber and questioning her financial management?" "If her activities prove legitimate," I said firmly, "I'll apologize for my suspicions and never question her financial decisions again." That evening, I prepared for what would either vindicate my concerns or convince my son that his mother had developed paranoid delusions about his wife's character. The irony wasn't lost on me. I would be taking my son to spy on his wife at the very restaurant where I'd been working undercover for a month. Bradley was about to meet Luna Stevens, the experienced waitress who had been serving Amber's criminal conspirators while quietly documenting their plans to steal our family fortune and murder his mother. Some family interventions involved discussions about addiction or mental health. This one involved showing my son that his wife was a criminal mastermind who had manipulated him into enabling theft, fraud, and conspiracy to commit murder. Tomorrow evening, Bradley would discover whether his mother was a paranoid elderly woman, or whether his wife was a sociopathic criminal who had been planning to destroy our entire family. And Luna Stevens would work her last shift at Lumiere, because Dorothy Morrison was about to reveal herself in the most dramatic family confrontation of our lives. Bradley and I arrived at Lumiere on Monday evening 30 minutes before Amber's scheduled meeting. It gave me time to position him at the bar, where he could observe table 14 without being detected by his wife. I changed into Luna's disguise in the car. Bradley sat silently beside me, still processing the shock of watching his 72-year-old mother, or family assets he might receive. A mortgage refinancing agreement that used my property as collateral without my knowledge or consent. Investment account authorizations giving Amber control over Bradley's retirement funds and any assets transferred from family accounts. Most disturbing was a revised will. It left everything to Amber in the event of Bradley's death, with provisions transferring any inherited family assets directly into her control. "Bradley," I asked carefully, "did you read these documents before signing them?" "Amber explained everything," he said. "The power of attorney protects our finances if I'm incapacitated. The refinancing lowers interest rates. The investments maximize returns. And the will ensures Amber's protected if something happens to me. This power of attorney gives Amber authority over my assets if they're ever transferred to you," I said. "Did she explain that clause?" "She said it was standard language for married couples," he replied. "Mom, why are you questioning Amber's financial management? She's doubled our savings in the past year." I realized then that Amber had been showing Bradley fabricated account summaries, convincing him her management was brilliant, while quietly using his authorizations to access credit and loans that would eventually destroy his financial security. "Bradley," I asked, "have you ever seen original bank statements for these investment accounts? Or tax documents?" "Amber handles all that," he said. "She gives me monthly reports showing our portfolio performance. And you've never asked to see the actual statements." Across the table, documents Bradley could clearly see from the bar. Even at a distance, they looked like legal and financial instruments, not restaurant business materials. "The power of attorney documents have been successfully implemented," the legal specialist reported. "Bradley Morrison has unknowingly given his wife complete authority over his financial decisions, including access to family inheritance and property transfers." Bradley's wine glass froze halfway to his mouth. "And Dorothy Morrison's signature forgery?" the woman in the business suit asked. "Perfected," Amber replied, producing samples of my handwriting. I can replicate Dorothy's signature well enough to pass bank authentication for asset transfers. I watched my son's face cycle through shock, confusion, and dawning horror as he realized his wife was discussing forging his mother's signature for financial fraud. The timeline for asset liquidation? The financial professional asked. This week, Amber confirmed. We transfer Dorothy's accounts into our control, liquidate everything within 72 hours, and eliminate any potential witnesses before law enforcement can trace the transactions. Eliminate witnesses, Bradley whispered, apparently unaware he'd spoken aloud. The legal specialist opened his briefcase and withdrew the pre-signed death certificates, each bearing my name. Dorothy Morrison's age and recent widowhood make her vulnerable, he said calmly. Accidents wouldn't raise suspicion. Elderly people become inconvenient to family financial planning all the time. Bradley stood abruptly, knocking over his wine glass. The crash drew attention from nearby tables, including table 14. Excuse me, Amber called sharply toward the bar. Is there a problem over there? Bradley walked directly to table 14, his face pale with shock and fury. He stared down at his wife, at the forged documents, the practiced signatures, the fake death certificates bearing his mother's name. Amber, he demanded, his voice shaking. What the hell is this? Silence fell over the table as four criminals realized their carefully planned conspiracy had been exposed by the very man they had manipulated and intended to frame. Bradley, Amber said at last, forcing calm into her voice. What are you doing here? She looked around, then back at him. And how did you find me? Amber, you discussed murdering my mother. You forged her signature. You manipulated me into signing documents that would have made me legally responsible for financial fraud. Those aren't legitimate business activities. They're felonies. Bradley's voice shook as he confronted her. Bradley, I love you. Everything I did was to protect our family's interests, by planning to kill your mother and frame you for financial crimes. That was when Detective Hayes stepped forward, cutting the exchange short. He calmly informed Amber of her rights and began listing the charges she would face. Conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, identity theft, forgery, and participation in a criminal organization. Mrs. Morrison, we'll need detailed statements regarding your undercover surveillance and all evidence you've gathered during your investigation. Detective, I have recordings, photographs, witness testimony, and documentation spanning 4 weeks of criminal planning sessions conducted at this restaurant. And you're certain about the accuracy of what you observed and recorded? Detective, I spent 40 years running restaurants before working undercover here. I understand criminal activity when I see it planned 3 feet away from where I'm serving wine to people actively discussing my murder. As the arrested conspirators were transported for booking and arraignment, I stood inside Lumiere, surrounded by overturned tables, scattered evidence, and the wreckage of my family relationships, most painfully with a daughter-in-law who had planned to kill me for money. Bradley approached me, tears in his eyes, emotional devastation written across his face. Mom, I'm so sorry. I trusted Amber completely. I almost signed documents that would have given her access to everything you worked to build. Bradley, you were manipulated by professionals who specialize in psychological control and financial fraud. Trusting your wife was normal. Her betrayal of that trust was criminal. Some families uncover addictions, mental illness, or relationship problems, issues that can be addressed through counseling and support. Our family discovery was learning that Bradley's wife was a sociopathic criminal who had planned to steal our fortune, murder me, and frame my son for financial crimes that would destroy his life. And Luna Stevens had documented every detail of their conspiracy from the perfect position. An invisible member of the service staff, someone criminals never suspect could be an undercover family member gathering evidence for their arrest. 3 weeks after Amber's arrest, I sat in Detective Hayes' office reviewing the full scope of the criminal investigation, which had grown far beyond what I initially uncovered during my undercover surveillance at Lumiere. The conspiracy involving my daughter-in-law had tentacles reaching into multiple states and had victimized dozens of families through similar schemes of financial fraud and elder abuse. Mrs. Morrison, your undercover work has provided crucial evidence for prosecuting what appears to be a sophisticated criminal organization specializing in targeting wealthy elderly individuals through manipulation of their adult children. Detective, how many other families were targeted by Amber's criminal network? at least 15 that we've identified so far. The pattern involves identifying elderly individuals with substantial assets, infiltrating their families through romantic relationships with adult children, manipulating those children into signing legal documents, and then systematically stealing family wealth while eliminating any witnesses who become suspicious. I felt physically sick realizing that Amber's involvement with Bradley hadn't been a romantic coincidence. It had been calculated selection based on my financial assets and his psychological vulnerability to manipulation. Mrs. Morrison, we've also discovered that your daughter-in-law's real name isn't Amber Morrison. She is actually Samantha Cross, a convicted felon with prior arrests for financial fraud and identity theft in 3 different states. She's been using a false identity throughout her marriage to Bradley. A complete false identity, including fabricated educational credentials, employment history, and personal background. Everything Bradley believed about his wife's past was carefully constructed fiction, designed to make her appear trustworthy and competent with financial management. The revelation that Bradley had been married to someone who didn't actually exist was devastating. Every conversation, every shared experience, every intimate moment of their relationship had been built on lies designed to facilitate theft and fraud. Detective, what happens to Bradley legally? He signed documents that gave Amber authority to access family assets. The district attorney has reviewed all evidence and determined that Bradley was clearly a victim of criminal manipulation, rather than a willing participant in fraud. His cooperation with our investigation, and the evidence you gathered demonstrating his genuine shock at discovering the conspiracy, has cleared him of any criminal liability. Because of the legal protections your attorney implemented and the timing of the arrests, no money was actually stolen from your accounts. However, Bradley will need to work with financial institutions to revoke all authorizations he unknowingly signed. Margaret Henley spent weeks coordinating with banks and investment firms to ensure that every document Bradley had signed under false pretenses was legally voided, and that no unauthorized access to family assets remained possible. Dorothy, the power of attorney authorizations have been completely revoked. Margaret informed me during our meeting that afternoon. Bradley's signatures on those documents are legally meaningless now that we've proven they were obtained through criminal detection. But how could I live with someone for 3 years without realizing she was planning to murder my mother and steal our family's money? Because you loved someone who didn't actually exist. Amber Samantha created a fictional personality specifically designed to earn your trust while concealing her criminal intentions. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the therapist Bradley began seeing to process the psychological trauma of discovering his wife's true identity, explained that victims of elaborate deception often experience symptoms similar to those seen in survivors of cult manipulation or abusive relationships. The level of identity fabrication and psychological control your daughter-in-law employed represents sophisticated emotional abuse designed to suppress critical thinking about her behavior, Dr. Martinez told us during a family session. Bradley's failure to detect the deception is evidence of her skill, not his gullibility. 2 months after the arrests, the broader criminal investigation expanded to include federal authorities tracking organized financial fraud across state lines. Samantha Cross and her accomplices were facing charges in multiple jurisdictions for crimes involving millions of dollars stolen from elderly victims. Mrs. Morrison, your willingness to work undercover for weeks while documenting criminal planning has provided evidence that will likely result in substantial prison sentences for all involved conspirators. FBI agent Patricia Chun informed me during a briefing about the federal case. Agent Chun, how many years in prison are we discussing? Between the murder conspiracy charges, organized financial fraud, and multiple counts of elder abuse, she replied. The defendants are likely facing 20 to 30 years in federal prison. The trial proceedings began 6 months after my dramatic revelation at Lumiere, with my undercover surveillance serving as crucial evidence in the prosecution of the criminal conspiracy. Mrs. Morrison, Assistant District Attorney James Rodriguez said during my testimony, please describe for the jury your decision to work undercover at Lumiere Restaurant. I suspected that my daughter-in-law was involved in financial deception that threatened my family's security, I testified. So I disguised myself as a waitress to observe her private business meetings. And what did you discover during your surveillance? I discovered that she was planning to steal my life savings through forged signatures, manipulate my son into unwitting participation in financial fraud, and murder me if I interfered with their criminal activities. Mrs. Morrison, are you certain about the accuracy of what you observed? I spent 40 years in the restaurant industry before working undercover for 1 month serving tables where criminals planned my murder. I'm certain about every conversation I documented. Some mothers-in-law discovered their children's spouses were unfaithful or irresponsible. I discovered that my daughter-in-law was a professional criminal with multiple false identities who targeted our family for systematic financial destruction, while planning to murder me and frame my son for her crimes. My undercover work as Luna Stevens provided evidence that would keep those criminals in prison for decades, while protecting other families from similar targeting. The elderly woman who was supposedly too old to understand modern business concepts had become the key witness in prosecuting one of the most sophisticated elder abuse cases in state history. 1 year after Amber, known to the courts as Samantha Cross, was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, I found myself back at Lumiere for an unexpected reason. The restaurant had closed permanently after the criminal investigation destroyed its reputation. I had purchased the property through a shell company and was preparing to reopen it under new management as Morrison's contemporary, a tribute to the family restaurant legacy Robert and I had built together. Mom, are you sure you want to own the restaurant where we discovered Amber's criminal conspiracy? Bradley asked as we walked through the renovated dining room, where Table 14 had once hosted planning sessions for my murder. Bradley, I'm not letting criminals destroy a perfectly good restaurant because they used it for illegal activities. Besides, this property represents the best real estate investment opportunity I've seen since selling our original restaurant chain. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was now the legitimate owner of the establishment where I'd once worked undercover to expose financial fraud targeting my own assets. Luna Stevens had evolved from disguised surveillance operative to actual business owner in the span of 12 months. The renovations are complete, and the staff training program is ready for implementation, announced Marcus Thompson, the experienced restaurant manager I'd hired to oversee daily operations. We've eliminated tables 7 and 14, and 22 entirely and redesigned the layout to focus on family dining, rather than private business meetings. Excellent, Marcus, I said. I want Morrison's Contemporary to represent the kind of family-oriented dining experience my late husband and I believed in: honest food, fair prices, and genuine hospitality. The past year had been transformative for our family in ways that extended far beyond recovering from criminal victimization. Bradley had emerged from the psychological trauma of discovering his wife's deception with renewed appreciation for authentic relationships and healthy skepticism toward people who seemed too good to be true. Mom, Dr. Martinez says that surviving elaborate deception often makes people better at recognizing manipulation in the future, Bradley told me during one of our weekly dinners. I feel like I've learned to trust my instincts instead of ignoring red flags, just because I want to believe someone loves me. What red flags do you wish you'd recognized about Amber's behavior? I asked. Her reluctance to discuss her past in detail, her insistence on handling all financial decisions without explanation, and her subtle efforts to isolate me from family relationships that might have provided outside perspective on our marriage. Dr. Martinez had explained during family therapy sessions that victims of sophisticated psychological manipulation often blamed themselves for missing warning signs, but professional criminals were specifically trained to exploit normal human desires for love and trust. The goal of this type of fraud isn't just financial theft, she told us. It's psychological control that prevents victims from seeking help or questioning obviously suspicious behavior. The federal investigation revealed that Samantha Cross's criminal network had victimized 47 families across 8 states, stealing over $12 million through schemes targeting elderly individuals with substantial assets. Your mother's undercover surveillance provided the breakthrough evidence that allowed us to connect dozens of seemingly unrelated financial crimes to an organized criminal enterprise, Agent Chen explained during a briefing on the broader investigation results. How many other families were saved because of Mom's work at Lumiere? Bradley asked. At least 15 families who were being targeted for similar fraud schemes were protected once we arrested the primary conspirators, she replied. Your mother's willingness to work undercover likely prevented millions of additional dollars in theft and potentially saved lives. The most satisfying outcome came when our case prompted new federal legislation strengthening protections for elderly people targeted by financial fraud through family manipulation. The Morrison Act requires enhanced verification procedures for any financial transactions involving elderly account holders and power of attorney authorizations, Congressman David Walsh explained during the bill's signing ceremony, where I was invited as an honored guest. What specific protections does the legislation provide? A reporter asked. Banks and financial institutions must now implement mandatory waiting periods and independent verification requirements before processing large asset transfers requested by family members with power of attorney authority, Walsh said. The law also requires reporting suspicious patterns that might indicate elder abuse. Morrison's Contemporary opened 3 months later with a grand reopening celebration that drew local media attention, fascinated by the story of the grandmother who'd worked undercover to expose a criminal conspiracy at the very restaurant she now owned. Mrs. Morrison, what's it like owning the restaurant where you once worked in disguise? Channel 7 News reporter Jennifer Martinez asked during our opening night interview. It feels like justice, Jennifer, I replied. Criminals use this property to plan theft and murder, but now it's serving the community as a place where families can enjoy honest meals and authentic hospitality. And what advice would you give to other elderly people who suspect family members might be taking advantage of them financially? Trust your instincts. Document everything. And don't let anyone convince you that age makes you paranoid or confused when you notice suspicious behavior. Sometimes the people who dismiss your concerns as elderly confusion are exactly the ones trying to steal from you. The restaurant's success exceeded my expectations. Customers appreciated both the quality of the food and the story of resilience and justice the establishment represented. Mrs. Morrison, we're booked solid for the next 6 weeks, Marcus reported during our monthly business review. The combination of excellent cuisine and your remarkable personal story has created more customer loyalty than any marketing campaign ever could. Marcus, the most important thing is that we're providing genuine value to families who choose to dine with us. The personal story matters only when it enhances, never overshadows, the quality of food and service. Bradley had become deeply involved in restaurant management, applying lessons he'd learned about recognizing manipulation to hiring practices and staff supervision. While reviewing job applications one afternoon, he looked up and said, "Mom, I think my experience with Amber's deception has made me better at identifying people who might not be trustworthy. I pay attention to inconsistencies in personal histories and hesitation around providing verifiable references." Bradley, I replied. Those are valuable skills, both for business management and personal relationships. 6 months after reopening, Morrison's Contemporary had become one of the most successful restaurants in the city. It generated substantial profits while standing as a symbol of the importance of protecting elderly people from financial exploitation. Dorothy, you've transformed a site once associated with criminal conspiracy into a thriving business that honors your family's legacy in the food service industry, Margaret observed during one of our quarterly legal reviews. Margaret, I said, sometimes the best response to people who try to destroy you is building something better than what they attempted to steal. Many victims of financial fraud spend years recovering from the emotional and economic devastation caused by criminal manipulation. I chose a different path. I turned my victimization into a successful business venture, while helping change federal law to protect other families from similar crimes. And every time I walked through Morrison's Contemporary, I remembered that the elderly woman once dismissed as too old to understand modern business concepts had ultimately owned and operated the most sophisticated restaurant in the city. 2 years after my dramatic revelation at Lumiere, I stood in the kitchen of Morrison's Contemporary, watching Bradley train our newest server, a young woman named Sophie. She reminded me of myself at her age, eager to learn and determined to excel in the hospitality industry. Remember Sophie? Bradley explained with the confidence of someone who had learned hard-earned lessons about human behavior. The most important skill in restaurant service isn't memorizing menu details or perfecting wine pairings. It's observing customer behavior and recognizing when something seems off. What do you mean by off? Sophie asked, genuinely curious about the psychological side of customer service. If customers are having hushed conversations about financial documents, if someone seems nervous about being overheard, or if meetings don't align with the stated purpose of the reservation, Those are moments when staff should pay attention and potentially alert management. I felt a deep sense of pride watching Bradley apply painful but valuable wisdom to practical business management, while mentoring young staff members about professional awareness and personal safety. Bradley's training protocols have made Morrison's Contemporary one of the safest restaurants in the city, for both staff and customers, Marcus reported during our most recent business review. Employees feel confident identifying and reporting suspicious activity, and customers appreciate the added sense of security. Our success exceeded every projection I'd made during the business planning process. We became known not only for exceptional food and service, but as a restaurant where families could dine knowing their privacy and security were protected by trained professionals. Mrs. Morrison, Marcus informed me with unmistakable pride, the National Restaurant Association has requested that you present your staff training protocols at their annual conference. They want us to teach other restaurants how to identify criminal activity while maintaining excellent customer service? I asked. Exactly. Your undercover experience exposing criminal conspiracy, combined with our reputation for hospitality excellence and security awareness, represents a model other establishments want to learn from. The broader impact of our case continued to expand through legislative reform, law enforcement training programs, and public awareness campaigns focused on elder financial abuse. Dorothy, Agent Chun told me during a recent update, the Morrison Act has prevented an estimated $50 million in elder financial abuse during its first year alone. How are families responding to the enhanced verification requirements? I asked. Initially, some complained about additional paperwork and waiting periods, he admitted. But as awareness of elder fraud increases, most families now appreciate the protections. Dr. Martinez also used our family's experience to develop new therapeutic approaches for helping victims recover from elaborate psychological manipulation. Bradley's recovery after discovering his wife's criminal deception has provided valuable insight into how victims rebuild trust and confidence, she explained during a conference presentation on treating manipulation-induced trauma. What approaches have proven most effective? I asked during a follow-up session. Helping victims understand that their failure to detect professional deception reflects the criminal's skill, not the victim's gullibility. Survivors often develop an enhanced ability to recognize manipulation in future relationships. The most personally satisfying outcome was Bradley's genuine growth into someone who balanced healthy skepticism with a renewed capacity for authentic connection. 6 months ago, he began dating Rebecca, a teacher who valued his careful approach to trust and his commitment to honest communication. Mom, he told me during one of our weekly family dinners, Rebecca wants to meet you properly. She wants to hear about your undercover investigation and how our family recovered. What does Rebecca think about dating someone whose previous marriage was built on deception? I asked. She says surviving manipulation demonstrates strength and wisdom, Bradley replied. That it makes me a better partner for someone who values honesty and emotional maturity. Last month, I received an invitation that represented the ultimate validation of my undercover work. The FBI asked me to participate in training programs for agents investigating organized financial fraud targeting elderly victims. Mrs. Morrison, training director Maria Santos explained, your willingness to work undercover while gathering legally admissible evidence has provided a template for similar operations. What would my role be? I asked. You teach agents how to recognize criminal behavior, maintain cover during surveillance, and gather evidence that withstands prosecution. Your experience bridges victim advocacy and investigative expertise. That evening, as I walked through Morrison's Contemporary during peak dinner service, I reflected on the extraordinary transformation my life had undergone since discovering my daughter-in-law's plan to steal my fortune and murder me for it. The woman dismissed as too old to understand modern business now ran the city's most successful restaurant, trained FBI agents, and helped shape federal legislation protecting vulnerable families. Mrs. Morrison, Sophie said respectfully, Table 12 has requested to meet you personally. What did they say? They're an elderly couple celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. They wanted to thank the woman who proved that age brings wisdom and strength, not weakness. I approached the table with genuine pleasure. Good evening. I'm Dorothy Morrison. We followed your story in the news, the woman said through tears. You gave elderly people hope that we don't have to be victims. And your restaurant serves the best food and feels safer than anywhere we've ever dined," her husband added. "My daughter-in-law once told me I was too old to understand her sophisticated restaurant," I said. "So I worked there disguised as a waitress for 3 months. At one table, I heard plans to use my assets as collateral for loan sharks. At another, discussions of forged signatures and murder. On my final day, I left my wig and glasses on the table with a note. The old woman sees everything. Some daughters-in-law discover too late that elderly mothers-in-law have sharper instincts, better memories, and far more dangerous legal representation than expected. At 74, I was no longer merely Dorothy Morrison, the grieving widow dismissed and underestimated. I was Dorothy Morrison, restaurant owner, FBI consultant, legislative advocate, and living proof that some grandmothers respond to criminal targeting by becoming more formidable than anyone imagined. Every evening as I watched families enjoy safe, honest hospitality at Morrison's Contemporary, I remembered this truth. The best revenge against those who try to steal your dignity is building something far better than what they attempted to destroy. Some undercover operations end with arrests. Mine ended with justice, success, and the satisfaction of proving that age brings wisdom, resolve, and occasionally the perfect skill set for exposing criminal conspiracies from the inside. The end.